kept saying the worst thing that can happen to us is that prices go down, right? We can't have deflation. We can't have falling prices. That would be a disaster when that's what everybody wants. Everybody wants lower prices. That's why they have sales, right? When there's a sale, they lower the price. Nobody says, "Hey, let's raise prices," and expects people to come rushing in. Hey, that store is raising their prices. Let's quickly go and buy. No, it's, hey, we got a 20% off sale, got a 50% off sale. That's designed to get people to buy because they want to buy lower. They want to buy cheaper. The lower the price, the more you can afford. Falling prices are always good. It's BS. But they came up with this idea that we can't risk deflation, so we have to have a buffer. Okay, well, if we had 3 or 4 years of 1.5% inflation, that means we avoided deflation, right? We dodged that bullet. Why do we have to have even higher inflation now to make up for the fact that we didn't have deflation in the past? We don't need it. But it was all BS. They just had to come up with more excuses. Look, I will tell you the reason or where this 2% came from. I know I've mentioned it before on past podcasts, but I know I get some new listeners, so not everybody has heard the explanation. But here's where it comes from, because obviously Jerome Powell didn't know, because he could have given this answer, but he doesn't even know. He's the head of a central bank, and he has no idea where this 2% came from, right? Because he just says, well, we all just agreed. Like they had a big meeting. Here's what happened. New Zealand, which had very high inflation for many, many years because they were very socialist. They had a crisis. They had a fiscal crisis. They had a big economic collapse. And so they brought in a lot of free market reforms, which cut government spending. And they privatized a lot of government run businesses, right? And it was great. New Zealand went through an economic renaissance, and I invested a lot of money. I remember I was a big fan of New Zealand for many years. And one of the things that they did is they said, okay, we're gonna have a 2% inflation ceiling, a ceiling, not a target, a ceiling. Inflation needs to be below 2%. And this was the first central bank to have an official target. Everybody else talked about, well, price stability. Well, New Zealand actually said, we want stable prices, but we want to make sure that inflation stays below 2%. So if it ever gets to 2%, Reserve Bank of New Zealand, you got to do something. You got to keep inflation below 2%, because if it's above 2%, you failed at your job, right? So they didn't want to get to 2%. They actually wanted to stay as far away from 2% as possible. The further below 2%, the better, because that meant they didn't have to do anything, right? As the rate got close to 2%, they'd have to start tightening policy, because it was going to be too close to the ceiling, right? It's a ceiling. A ceiling means you stay below it, right? That's the whole purpose of a ceiling, to be beneath it. You don't want to be stuck to the ceiling, right? You want to be as far below it as you can, so you have some leeway, right? And if prices went down, that wouldn't have been a problem. That would have been great. Oh, great. Prices fell. Good news, right? Job well done. That's where it came from. When the ceiling became a target, again, it was only because we were below it. That's all. And in fact, I was making a lot of fun, particularly of Mario Draghi, when inflation in the Eurozone was like 1.5%. And he was saying it's not enough. We need to be close to, but under 2, right? Their target was not 2%. It was close to 2, but under 2. That's even more absurd than 2. So according to the ECB, 2 is too much, but 1.99 is perfect. That's how precise these guys were. And, which is nonsense to believe that you have that kind of precision anyway. I mean, what kind of arrogance do you have to actually believe you can fine tune the inflation rate to the point where you can get 1.99? And then to actually think that that's somehow better than 1.98, right? But Draghi was saying we need more inflation. It's not high enough. And what was I saying back then? Not only was I calling him out for his BS, I said, what is he going to do? He's trying to notch inflation up from 1.5 to 1.9, right? And they're printing all this money, doing this massive QE. They're holding interest rates at negative, all because they think the cost of living is not going up enough, that the poor Europeans are stuck with a 1.5% inflation rate when they deserve 1.99. And we're going to do all this reckless stuff to deliver a higher increase in the cost of living, because that's what people want. That's the big problem in the Eurozone. Prices aren't rising fast enough. That's the problem. That's the problem. Of all the problems they have in Europe, the one they wanted to solve was that stuff wasn't getting more expensive quicker, and they were going to solve that problem. So I kept saying, okay, what happens if you're trying to go from 1.5 to 1.9 and you overshoot? And what if you end up at 5 or 6 or 7? Then what are you going to do? Because now you're way over. You're not just under by a little bit. You're over by a mile. Why risk it? Well, you know why they risked it? Because they didn't give a damn. Because it was all BS. They just wanted to delay the day of reckoning. They didn't want the politicians in the Eurozone to have to cut government spending and be honest with the people. So they made up this cock and bull theory about inflation targets of 2% just because they could justify the money printing because they were below 2%. And they didn't give a damn about what happened in the future because they never care about the future, except now, the future's here. And now they're dealing with inflation that's way above that 2% target. Anyway, I want to finish up the podcast, though, by talking about politics again, because since my last podcast, which I did, on Sunday, right? Donald Trump has been indicted yet again for the 4th time. I even joked about that on my last podcast when I talked about his 3rd indictment. I said, whenever there's some more bad news that comes out at Hunter, there's just going to be another indictment of Trump. And of course, that's exactly what happened. You get more bad news out of the Bidens, and they pull out another indictment against Trump. Now that's 4. I mean, I don't know if he's looking at 1,000 years in jail or something like that on all these charges. But this one is the state of Georgia that has now indicted Trump and about 15 or 16 other people, including his chief of staff. I mean, Rudy Giuliani. I forget who else. There's a big, long name of people. And this is all about challenging the results of the Georgia election, which he's allowed to do. I mean, it's hard to think of a close election that wasn't contested. I mean, you're a fool if you don't contest the results of an election, because maybe you'll win. I mean, what else you got to lose? You invest all this time and money in a campaign, and now we have one election and it's over, and you lose by I don't know how many votes. I mean, but you don't got to, ask, demand a recount, have inquiries. I mean, if I was a donor, if I donated to a campaign, if I worked hard as a volunteer, I wouldn't expect my guy to just say, okay, no, do what you can to question the outcome and, take another bite at the apple, right? Maybe there was something wrong. Maybe you could snatch the victory out of the jaws